I have the great honor of having been asked to moderate this final panel, which will be also very informal and a sort of town hall. So what the job we have in the next 40 minutes or so is to, first of all, capture the sort of most salient points from the three workshops. I attended a very interesting workshop on political narrative, which, for those of you who are in the room, I thought was very rich and full of ideas and examples. But like, I missed the other three, so I'm keen to hear from our four rapporteurs, if you will, about what the most salient points were on those four panels. And then what we'll do is I will turn to you if you still have energy left to hear about maybe two or three sort of takeaways that you have for the day, or things that you that will stick with you on the ride home. I know Wolfgang will promote this, but I want to do it too. There's the reception at 6:30 at the School of Public Policy, in case anybody needs for the panel on the Hungarian elections. I'm very getting a full brief on that, and there's flyers outside and directions in your book. So let's get started with the forward. Voting, yes. Anyone in their purse or pocket has a voting machine? Have you used these? Those things are incredibly expensive, so if you could remember to return it on your way out. I think we have most of them, but I think there's a couple missing. And we'll find you. They're tracked, so we'll send the police over to your house later on. Okay, who's going to start? Go, please.
Okay, thank you. I can start as we were the first workshop on legal institutions. We did, however, forget that we had 2 minutes. So if I do forget anything, then any of the participants who are here, and I see some of your faces, can sort of add on to the end. I'll be quite brief. So legal institutions, we started first by summarizing the current situation. Suffice it to say, it wasn't the most optimistic picture that we painted. Well, some of the key sort of discussion points involved, first of all, legal institutions and how they can be used for human rights advocacy. The sort of bottom line for that is, well, they don't really work, at least not on their own, not individually. So that includes sort of European Court of Human Rights and so on, and conventions and so on. So some examples of that is that, I mean, it's often not easy to get constituencies or minorities to chase up and follow up cases with the European Court of Human Rights, and it also takes time. Sometimes there's not always full agreement even amongst the populations that you target in terms of the decision. There was a specific example regarding segregation in Verona kids in schools, and that goes back to sort of the need for education, which I'll mention several times. And the main issue is sort of the reason why they don't work is because quite often there are cases of non-implementation despite the decision of the European Court of Human Rights. So the kind of take-home message was that, well, okay, they don't work alone, but maybe we don't have to just get rid of them altogether, but perhaps a good approach is to use them in synergy with sort of advocacy as well as sort of public education and educating our communities, communities of minorities, as well as sort of the broader public in terms of the importance and the needs for these institutions and what they can achieve. The second point is that we discussed is, okay, well, what do you do when the law is against you and when you have legislation that is proactively just not in your favor as a minority? Well, again, the main points there are focusing on advocacy and public education. Public education has more of a long-term impact because if you change education now, you probably won't see effect immediately. But there also has to be a focus on human rights as something non-negotiable. So we refer to several cases where issues were put to referendum across Europe. So the situation in Croatia with marriage, as well as a number of other countries, some referendum in Switzerland, and so on. Another point was about broadening constituencies. So how do you get more people on board with your cause? Perhaps I should have mentioned this at the beginning. We had sort of a variety of a variety on the discussion panel. We had one representative from a national sort of level in Poland, and then the other three were sort of European or international networks. So it's how do you focusing on sort of specific issues, either LGBT issues or NR, which is on racism. And the idea there is that okay, well you have to build alliances, you have to work together. So taking sort of an intersectional approach, not just focusing as an organization that deals with human rights just on their own population, but trying to sort of broaden your scope. So forming alliances is a very important way of broadening your constituency. And then some final points, well, rather final sort of question that came up towards the end of the panel, which is really interesting, but we don't actually have an answer to, is how do we separate sort of public institutions with a declining faith in EU and European institutions, and how do we keep the good legal frameworks of the EU and the good legal frameworks and instruments in place, despite the fact that they're not necessarily always working as well as we want them to, and that there is declining sort of public faith. That's kind of in a nutshell. And again, if I forgot anything or misrepresented something that was said, please holler or
Somebody didn't take notes. Anyone on in that group add anything or comment? Okay. Maybe we'll let's move to economic review.
I was Michael Rocha, speaking faculty. I was the moderator of the economic teams working group. It was quite a lively and wide-ranging discussion. I can tell you. Of course, it is an extremely broad topic area. So one thing that was most surprising to me as the moderator of the event, given kind of the heterogeneous nature of the participants, it was very surprising the extent to which there was general agreement that further economic integration is part of the solution rather than part of the problem. To me, that was quite surprising. There was a consensus that this kind of aids in eliminating ridiculously crowded macroeconomic risks and tear apart the fabric of society. That it's part of further economic integration to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The European-wide economic governance has to become more inclusive. The stakeholders have a voice at the table, and their terms are not going to be dictated to national economies by groups of international organizations. Something I guess following this or alongside this is that economic integration can only be part of the solution rather than part of the problem if it is coupled with greater political and legal organization. If these economies are in a competitive environment, then parameters of competition finally, it was noted that really the big trade-off in this discussion, especially as it concerns rollback of democracy, is that these objectives can only be achieved by a release of national economy. So the democratic capital at the European level is quite a crucial parameter success of this project. On that, so there were some interesting, I guess, discussions on what can be done to deepen the democratic capital at a European level and further establish European identity, some of which were in terms of common educational policies and the criteria. Finally, there was a lot of discussion. We had two brief panels. So there was a lot of discussion on austerity policy, their role in this process. And I guess if the consensus was there, it seems to be that these policies would have had a much different flavor had the Eurozone been more integrated with so I know that doesn't cover all of the points made in the wide-ranging discussion, but if there were some things that
Great. Anyone within that group want to comment? We can see the first similarities emerging. I think maybe it would make sense to end with civil society. Maybe you want to go next from the narrative.
Yeah, happy. We had a quite fascinating and wide-ranging discussion, which I was trying to summarize in three points of structure and 3 points of conclusion. So first of all, we tried to explore the question of how to conceive of a strong democratic narrative in Europe by looking at 3 challenges. First, the rise of Euroscepticism, or more specifically, we looked at it through the lens of the loss of Euro enthusiasm in the new member states. And a very interesting argument was offered that in some ways the structural deficits in some of those countries actually brought in the European level into the messy domestic politics and thereby contributed to this rise of Euroscepticism through actually Europeanization of politics, which I thought was an interesting look at this challenge of Euroscepticism. The second challenge was to look at the rise of extremism and far-right political parties and their impact on the political mainstream. And again, we touched on a point that was raised earlier in some of the panels, in which the mechanism through which the far right managed to capture political space was also enhanced to the willingness of the mainstream parties to engage in those topics. And then the third challenge was we looked at the questions of minorities and the difficulty of fostering a positive narrative on minorities. And here we had a very interesting case study of how the anti-Roma narrative gained strength in France, and some of the mechanisms that the policy entrepreneurs employed in this movement. So based on that, and we only started to scratch the surface really of what are possible intervention points in changing this narrative by looking at the challenges and the success of a narrative, a political narrative that challenges democracy in Europe. Three ingredients. We tried to get to some concrete points, but and I'm slightly summarizing several points that were made. The first was to actually deliver on policies, so to avoid some of the structural problems that allow policy spaces to be occupied, delivering on concrete issues such as corruption, other national grievances that can be observed. The second element is communication. and actually being able to change frames of policy discussions and being able to communicate complexity in a way or complex political issues in a way that makes them more palatable in a political discourse. And that connects with the third element in a way. Communication allows then hopefully to spin the challenges as assets of a positive narrative. And that's where it's sort of the simple answer to the challenge of the political narrative. It's just the opposite of Euroscepticism, far right, and a challenge to minorities. But of course, that's not enough. We need to understand what mechanisms we can actually use in channeling and developing those messages. And here maybe there are lessons to be learned from some of the examples that we looked at and how successfully negative narratives were able to spread. So much in conclusion. There are others that are qualified to comment on some of those aspects.
Thank you. Maybe we'll get to those additional points from that panel, which I thought was extremely interesting. There were also some discussions about the impact of the retreat of the state. That really is the far right progresses so much quicker when the state, when there's no longer basic state services. I think the example that was mentioned in Eastern Hungary, that's largely the case, and that's where Jobbik holds the highest, and that's certainly true in France with the National Front. I know that. Okay, let's finish this round with.
The choice between microphones, always choose the yellow microphone. It's my rule of thumb number one. So I'm going to follow a similar sort of eclectic drawing across a couple of observations from our conversation, which is varied. We touched on a number of different things, but I'm going to talk about 3 challenges and 3 opportunities. The first is sort of unpacking what we actually mean by civil society. So there's conversation about how often is civil society actually civil. How much of what we're talking about here is a rollback against democracy, the hollowing out of democracy, or democratic deficit, and how much of it is actually the sorts of grassroots responses to the sorts of challenges that are triggered by the economic and political processes that's here. And so this led to a larger conversation about whether or not civil society is civil, and whether or not civil society actually complies entirely with NGOs, in particular the constitution of support. The second point is a secondary challenge then around the fact that there's no sort of pan or trans-European space for organizing and mobilizing. So on the panel we have individuals representing sort of nationally rooted political spaces that have become transnational or now engaging in contexts that are inherently transnational in their puzzle with the project. And the puzzle then becomes, if you're going to mobilize and activate, where's the space? Where's the space that occurs? There's a national space, there's a linguistic space, there's an online, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is the second sort of challenge and hurdle that we have. The third was translating grassroots mobilization into political capital in the face of using the American space in the face of political gain. So the example being the Obama campaign, which was really wonderful and amazing job of mobilizing activity at the grassroots, getting people to make peer-to-peer, human-to-human, interpersonal links around the campaign. But then all of those links, all of that information, and all that data connections, and everything that whole platform disappearing into a re-election campaign. The opportunity for a large mobilization that may have held the Obama administration to account, perhaps triggered something like a leftist-centered Tea Party and mobilized energy in that way, disappeared into party politics. I said 3, the 4th. Really, the left needs to offer this
than nonetheless offers compelling and mobilizing visions for this sort of analysis of the present and vision something condition has spoken about in the last panel, and where that vision voice that is mobilizing leaders around the world they feel like opportunities. Several of these. The answer then is we discussed together the participants and actionable, like real actionable, real action that individuals can take to give them a sense of action towards motion in the world that they live in. So the remedy for the last obstacle that I just for examples of this that came up, and so they know to reflect this on what's going on. Also a shift in our thinking from right and wrong to right and left, to recognizing a little bit of debate between the side of ends up, but recognizing and respecting the nature and practice of the that we get heard finally, I really like this sense from 140 joiners. There's one slide on the screen that said, has a map with sort of tweet and self-reporting based protest incident data, and it says, you are 3 kilometers away from this event. Would you like to bear witness? And this is sort of the operationalization of this idea that individuals, if they feel, I'm actually 3 kilometers away, I'm on my phone, I set directions there. This is a sort of very small and granular intervention that helps individuals have a real lived experience of having done something that ideally translates into
Great. Thank you very much. So now we'll just open it up for a few minutes. So what I would love for you, I know it's the end of the day, so I'm asking for the last effort on your part, but what I would love for you to do is to think about, 2 or 3 things that you heard today, either on this, these summaries of those workshops or during the rest of the day, that will stick with you. And I will start with mine. Before I do so, I read a really interesting book that I highly recommend. I'm not looking at it, I don't know this person, but it's called The Confidence Trap, and it's about a history of democracy in crisis from World War I to the present. And as I was kind of referring to before, it puts things into great perspective and sort of lowered my anxiety level about our current state of affairs quite a lot. It's kind of David Runciman from Cambridge. I've never heard of him before we spoke about it. I recommend it highly. And if others have other positive, hopeful readings to recommend, I think we do a little bit of that. So before I call on all of you, I will share my 2, 3 very basic takeaways. I think it was Francesca this morning who said that the EU should promote itself as defending freedom, not imposing rules or regulations. And the EU as a defender, I thought was a sort of positive notion that would be good in its communication. I think in some of the panels this morning, political communications, there was a example this morning of the EU handing T-shirts. I think the EU and democracy in general does need to focus on its communication and its narrative more, and it's not about handing T-shirts. I totally agree with you, Austin, and that was on my notes that the progressive side, the progressive side definitely need more compelling narratives, positive stories, and we've been beaten on that front soundly for the past several decades, and I think we really need to work on that. And my last point, very briefly, in the breakout that I attended, there was a point that was very basic, I would say, about Ukraine. Listen to what the people who have been there day in, day out, waving EU flags, listen to Maidan Square, because maybe they know what democracy represents or what the EU represents for them, and that might be a sort of hope. So my fourth takeaway was kind of listen to Maidan Square a little bit more. Enough with me. Now over to you. So would anyone like to share anything, takeaways, things that you will remember from this day, the most interesting thing you've read on Twitter, something on the floor is yours. Maybe you've reached the end of the energy level. No, thank you. And please introduce yourself.
My name is Anya from European Parliament, and I come from Ukraine. And that's why was one of your takeovers was very interesting for me, because for me a surprise was here to listen to so many negative aspects of democracy development. And basically, I didn't expect that at all. And every single panel discussion, and I've been in the political narrative group, it was all about how negatively developed the democracy in Europe. And standing there for over the last 3 months on Maidan, exactly what you told, and believing so much in democracy, which the EU can suggest to us, and that's basically why was the first reason we went there. So that's just kind of effort which I have now. I don't have any conclusion to that, but something that's it for me. And thank you very much for organizing this event and for inviting us. But, good.
So you've actually come from Ukraine?
Yes,
Right.
I come from Spain. Yeah.
Well, the grass is always greener. Yeah, that's nice, but the grass is green at all. Anybody else? Hard to beat my done, but try. Please.
Well, yes, first of all, I also want to thank, Rollback for organizing this conference for the really important, day, and the timing was, fortuitous as well, and, I learned a lot. I, learned, essentially that the center and the left have much to learn in terms of messaging from the right. And that today's, or yesterday's triumph by Fidesz had as much to do with the left's inability to translate, its message into understandable and appealing narrative, as it did with Viktor Orban's very considerable political, skills. I take nothing away from Orban. He won the race, and but in addition to winning the race, the left lost it by its very poor messaging. And so I hope this is a wake-up call for a new opposition movement, because no country can afford to have one single political party, not if it calls itself democracy. The burden is now, as Scott said earlier today, on a new generation of politicians, and I know some of them were in this room.
Yeah, thanks a lot. The BBC coined, I think they coined the term dictatorship, which is quite a victory of Viktor Orban. Yeah. Yes. There were two people. Did you want to speak? Yes.
Yes, I just add to what Scotty said, the third element, and that's how systematically the election system and public discourse and the functioning of the media has been screwed up in Hungary. So it's true that the left-wing opposition did very badly. It's true that Viktor Orban has some skills, but he has a lot of skills in screwing up the system. And so for a takeaway for myself, and I suggest this as a takeaway for others as well, to think about how could he screw up the rules of the game in the middle of our European Union, and I put on my EU hat now, how could we let it happen? Why our European institutions let it happen that in a member state the media can be so controlled as it is in Hungary now, which means that even if the left-wing opposition had wonderful inspirational messages, it would have been extremely hard to reach the majority of the population, which is getting information from sources controlled by skilled electoral banks.
Right. No, I think that's a very good point. I think also, I mean, we're not talking about either or. I mean, these are bits of the puzzle. So if you get better narratives on the left, if you get more citizen participation using technology or not, if you get a civil society that's a bit more got its act together, if you get legal institutions that are functioning better, than the whole thing starts to look better. There's one more person, yes, right here.
also a PhD student here in Budapest. And I would have a follow-up comment, a comment that relates both to the comments of Peter and Kati. And I think that at least as far as the Hungarian case is concerned, it was not about messaging. It was about content. So it was not about having a good narrative or a good analysis or a good message and then not being able to communicate it well. It's about a lack of thought. It's about not being able to address those economic and social issues that most of the population is concerned about. And I think that is a very important takeaway lesson from the Hungarian case, and also relates to what Peter said, that how could this happen, right? And I think much of the explanation for that is that the pre-2010 regime, which was a constitutional democracy as opposed to the current regime, but it was also widely perceived, and rightly so, as very unjust, as very unequal, and for that reason as not being legitimate. So for many, it didn't seem worthy of saving. It didn't seem worthy of fighting for. And I think that is a general lesson that if there are strong movements or forces hostile to democracy or hostile to liberal democracy, then it is quite likely that there are unaddressed distributed conflicts, unaddressed class inequalities in the background, and by unaddressed I mean unaddressed by the left or any political party or movement that would frame these or interpret these problems not in a far right wing fashion, but in a more egalitarian fashion. And if you recommended the book, I would also do so. I have a personal message of or personal mission of recommending the book to people. It's by David Ost, and it is for the defeat of solidarity, politics of anger, and it is about Poland. But I found it very enlightening in making sense of the Hungarian situation. So that makes me suspicious that maybe it is also useful for other countries, and it is specifically about how if the left is unable to address and interpret the grievances that are based in class inequalities, then someone else will. And most likely it will be far right-wing movements which interpretation is not conducive to liberal democracy. And so perhaps paradoxically, at least from our current perspective, and especially in Eastern Europe, class-based politics, or what could be termed class struggle, even is actually conducive to liberal democracy and liberal outcomes, as opposed to the situation in which these economic grievances get framed in identity politics or far-right-wing inside identity politics, such as ethnicism, nationalism, or sexualism.
I don't want anybody to relate to this reception. So, final thought, comment that was burning, maybe not about Hungary. No. Anyone? Okay, great. Well then, we will close this panel. Thank you very much to the four rapporteurs. And I wanted to, before I hand the microphone, also thank and congratulate the Central European University and the School of Public Policy for holding this discussion, which is incredibly timely, not just because we are on the day after what historians will regard as probably a pretty significant election, but also because we're in the middle of an electoral cycle in Europe in which the rollback of democracy is clearly such a major issue. European elections are coming in 2 weeks. In my own country of France, we've just taken a massive beating with Marine Le Pen emerging as perhaps the dominant force in French politics. So really, I think this is extremely timely, very diverse, rich. I certainly enjoyed it, and so I wanted to ask you to join me in thanking CDU and the School of Public Policy for organizing this inquiry.
Thank you, Mathieu, and thank you for holding out and moderating this last panel, and of you for doing such an excellent job in summarizing the workshop. Despite all the what you might think negative I'm very energized. I got exactly out of it what I wanted to, namely, at least for me, a wake-up call. And as I said this morning when I opened the conference, we shouldn't take things for granted. It's time to rediscover democracy. It's time to put democracy back into the hands of the people. I remind you of the wonderful short video that we saw that was very graphic in one way. So I'm very happy, and I think we can take this forward. I think there will be many more wake-up calls coming our way before we see a change. The next one, if not sooner, certainly will be the elections to the European Parliament, and that hopefully will generate a reaction. If there's action, there must be reaction, and it's time to react. And I think we can come up with a good narrative, and I think it's relatively easy. And as Heather said, you know, what and Francisca, what is the purpose of the European Union? I think there's a lot of purpose, both within Europe but also globally, because contestation of democracy is not just taking place at the national level. That's what we discussed today, but I think there's also a global context of democracy that we shouldn't lose sight of, and that will keep us busy over the years to come. So I'm very, very happy. I cannot recommend a book or a paper right now, but I can tell you that there will be one coming, in the sense that rather than me trying to summarize all this, we will produce a paper trying to summarize some of the output that this forum has generated, maybe adding a little bit more. We may well be in touch with some of you to find out more, push you a little bit more, what you had in mind when we go over the notes. And so in a couple of months, we hopefully will produce a policy paper that will summarize some of the most important key points that we heard today and take them further. The paper hopefully will be one way of staying in touch with all of you, and hopefully we'll find other ways. We of course hope to try and find support to continue this conversation. I think it's really necessary, and I think we will, and I very much hope that we can be part of this conversation. So let me, before I have to say some things, and some very important things, and point you to the motto of the School of Public Policy. And when we created, or when we thought about the motto, which is purpose beyond power, we're a little bit ambivalent. We did this about 3 years ago, but I think it turned out to be quite correct. And I think I always come back to that motto of purpose beyond power, making sure that power is a means to an end, however contested it may be, but it's not an end in itself. And I think what we have seen over the last couple of years in this country, and certainly yesterday, it very much reminds me of being very much an end in of itself. And by the way, I also thought the discussion over digital democracy, on whichever side you will come down, the sense that I got, there's a tremendous power up for grabs in who will take, if you will. There's a huge battle going on and raging that I have learned a lot about today as to who will control digital communication, who will control the internet. And it's an extremely politicized environment. And I don't think it has peaked whatsoever. And I think here, a huge battle over political power, economic power, and social power is just about to begin, and will keep us busy over the years to come, if not decades. So on that note, and in announcing the policy paper, let me actually, Kathy, thank you very much. She's no longer here. She thanked me for putting up this conference, but I didn't do that. There are a couple of people I'd like to call on, and I hope they're here, and thank them tremendously for the time, the effort, the brains, and anything else they put into it. And Polina, if you could come here for a moment forward, you need to see those faces. Emisha, Krista, Emisha, come down here. Here's Krista, Antonio, Lucas, please come close in. Okay, you gotta come down here. Give a big applause. These were the real people behind this conference that did a fantastic job. And thank you so much. Keep the person. Okay. Thank you very much for coming. We'll continue a little bit with Hungary. I invite you over to our reception. And thanks. Hopefully we'll all keep in touch. Thank you again.